Yeah, and that's the point that he makes.
If you're going to bear false witness against John, he might lose his life over that. That bearing of false witness was very serious and had serious consequences, and obviously why it's such an abomination to God.
And that's the point that he makes over in verse 25, that a truthful witness saves lives, but the one who breathes out lies is deceitful. That there is real consequences that are on the line for those things. In verse 6, he then gets into the idea of scoffers, that scoffers seek wisdom in vain, but the knowledge is easy for a man of understanding. I want to give you two New Testament passages. So Jesus tells us in Matthew chapter 7 not to cast your pearls before swine, and it's always a challenge to know exactly when that happens. So he makes the point here that scoffers are people who are not really looking for truth. They're just people who are going to argue over or debate over it. And it's really hard sometimes to know when that is happening. But I think that this is going to be a key passage to understand in connection with Matthew chapter 7 without casting our pearls before swine. The other one is that knowledge is easy for a man of understanding. Paul tells us over in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 that the Spirit interprets spiritual truths to those who are spiritual. It's one of those odd verses right at the end of chapter 2. But the idea being that the more that you learn about God and the more that you apply it to your lives, the easier it is to kind of grow in more knowledge of truth. And I think that's what Solomon is speaking of here in verse 6, that once you begin to grow, continue to grow is an easier thing than it is for a scoffer to grow. And so he then tells us in verse 7 to leave the presence of a fool, for there you do not meet words of knowledge. Again, you can think of so many other verses that kind of tie into this. The evil company corrupts good morals. Or for those who spread wrong speech. We go over to 2 Timothy chapter 2, and he speaks of Hymenaeus and Alexander, whose speech spreads like gangrene. Individuals that you are to avoid those irreverent babbles and controversies over words that Paul talks to Timothy about. That wisdom, also comes here in Proverbs. If there's a fool, he's not going to give you words of wisdom. It's not just going to come about. So not to keep company with them.
Do you think, Chad, in verse 6, that would be wrong to apply that to, well, obviously seeking godly wisdom for knowledge versus seeking worldly wisdom? Like the scoffers are seeking wisdom, but they're not seeking godly wisdom, they're seeking worldly wisdom, and they find it, but they didn't really find it because they didn't find true wisdom.
Yeah, I think it's a good application. He says here in verse 8, the wisdom of the prudent is to discern his way, but the folly of fools is deceiving. He's mentioned, or how about Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 15, where he tells us to be circumspect, to walk circumspect, or to examine your own feet, as some translations render it. That the wisdom of the prudent is to discern his ways, to look at where you're going, to watch what your fruit is. If we're to be known by our fruits, I think we can also be known to ourselves by our fruits, which I think is the point of Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 15, or here Proverbs 14 and verse 8, the wisdom of the prudent is to discern his way. But the folly of the fool is deceiving. Does a fool always know that he is being foolish? Yeah, we tend to deceive ourselves when we're fools to believing that we are wise, and we continue to perpetuate that idea, that false understanding, by never really paying attention to ourselves. And that's the point that he's making here in verse 8. If you want to be wise, then you really have to examine your actions. You got to examine your motives. You got to be someone who is prudent. And that's what he begun the whole book. Verse 15 of chapter 14, just a couple verses down, the simple, believe everything, but the prudent gives thoughts to his steps. Those two verses go hand in hand. And Solomon introduced the entire book in chapter 1, verse 4, to say that wisdom is going to give discretion or give prudence to the simple. That wisdom is going to do that, but there's this process that goes into verse 8 and verse 15. That you're not going to believe everything, and you're going to examine yourself carefully for those things. I think those two ideas go hand in hand. How about verse 9? If someone would read verse 9 for us.
Fools comfort sin, but among the upright there is favor.
Yeah. So some translations say that the fool mocks the guilt offering or the sin offering, and the upright enjoy acceptance. So slightly different translations, but kind of dealing with the same thing. Have you seen people who just seem to wear their sins lightly and almost like a badge of honor or something that they're proud of, the way that they live their life, knowing that other people don't approve of it? And that's the point that he makes. The fools, they mock their sin, or they mock their sin offering, whichever one, and the upright enjoy acceptance, and I think acceptance from God in that case. He says in verse 10 that the heart knows its own bitterness, and no stranger shares its joy. What does he mean by that?
Honest self-reflection to identify it.
Have you ever told someone, I'm sorry what you're going through, I know what you're going through, I've been there, and they get really angry at you that you haven't been there, you've never walked in my shoes? I think that's what Solomon's getting at here, is that the heart knows his own bitterness. On the negative side, we kind of assume that we're going to be all alone in our sufferings, kind of unrightfully so on our end. At the same time, from the outside perspective, can you ever truly, fully, experience what someone else experienced in their suffering? No. The loss of your loved one's not going to be exactly the same as the loss of someone else's loved one, or the loss of your job is not going to be the same as the loss of their job necessarily, or any other aspect of life. And the same thing comes on the other side of the coin, which is that no one shares in its joy. You can rejoice with those who rejoice, and you can weep with those who weep, but do you really, truly experience what they experience? You do, but maybe not in the exact same way, same fashion that they do. And I think what he's giving us here is wisdom on how to deal with other people. Do I assume that I know exactly what someone else is going through? If I'm wise, I probably don't. In the same way, and that goes for both sorrow and for joy in verse 10. If someone would, let's read verses 11 and 12.
The house of the wicked will be overthrown, but the tent of their upright will flourish. There's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death.
I think these are two more proverbs that seem to go together. Obviously, they stand by themselves, and probably verse 12 is the one that is probably most well known from chapter 14 as a whole. But I think these two go together, that the house of the wicked is destroyed, the tent of the upright will flourish. And it's one of those times that Solomon does a word play for us to understand that here is a wicked person who has prospered in their wickedness to the extent of building a house. And he says that even in that scenario, ultimately, they're destroyed in that. But in the converse is, here is a person who is righteous or upright, and at this point, all they have is a tent, but that'll flourish. And I've been working my way through the Bible chronologically, so I'm just finishing up Genesis and just getting into the middle of Exodus. And I'm thinking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who, for all of their lives, they lived in tents until God promised that all those who lived in houses would be destroyed and that they would inherit the house. And it took them 400 years, but that's just an example of someone who dwelt with a lot less and then prospered ultimately through their uprightness rather than working faster for a lower gain.
Chad, on that,
Mhm.
did you think about the other side of that, those houses of those that were evil, of the Amorites, or
Yeah.
those in the land of Canaan, who had spent all that time and effort building, and they were destroyed, and those houses were lived in by,
Mhm.
And it makes me think also of the rich man who, you know, that God, thinking about God or putting God first in his life, just thinking about how great he's doing, he just tears down his barn, builds bigger ones, and you fool, he didn't even know that tonight is the end of your life. You know, he didn't even think about planning for the real future.
Mhm.
Made me think of him as well during this, that house of the wicked will be overthrown.
Mhm. So he mentions that there's a way that seems right to man, but his end is the end or the way of death. He mentions this again over in chapter 16, in verse 18, or something similar at least, in verse 18 and verse 25, that pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. And then in verse 25, that there's a way that seems right to man, but his end is the way of death. Almost the exact same phrase. Why would Solomon repeat this idea?
Because I think it's natural for me to think I'm doing the right thing. And by myself, I will think I'm doing the right thing. And if I haven't included God in that wisdom or that knowledge, if I don't have godly wisdom or knowledge, it doesn't matter how smart I might be, like you mentioned, a president being very smart, it doesn't matter, and you don't do very well if you're not if you don't have godly wisdom. If you have godly wisdom, then certainly that way will lead to life, not to death. But if all I'm gonna do is whatever I think is a good idea, that way will lead to death.
Tamika, have you ever said something to your students and then just never said it again and everyone understood it and followed it?
No.
Oh. I think Solomon finds the same thing true about us, that sometimes we just need it repeated a few more times until it sinks in.
I never went through Proverbs 14, looking at these this way. Verse 1, it's very fitting for everything following, in particular the foolish woman who pulls down her own house. The fool basically who's seeking for wisdom in verse 6 and doesn't find it, and the fool who's seeking the way that seems right to them. As a result, you've destroyed your house.
Mm-hmm. It's a very good point. Verse 13 struck me as I was going through this for Bible class tonight, that even in laughter the heart may ache, and the end of joy may be grief. I've been reading some apologetics recently. I'm not going to try to quote them because that's just going to go terribly for everybody involved. But the one guy makes the point that the problem of pain really isn't the problem that we most wrestle with. Most of us are able to experience pain, see some benefit in it, and then move on with our life. The problem that we experience is getting all the pleasure that we want and finding the pleasure lacking. And so what we find is a whole era of people who are at the most privileged part of our society, who, we'll pick on college students, sorry about this, but we send off the bright, intelligent students, we let them live kind of work-free for a couple of years, we tell them that they're at the pinnacle, the keystone of our society, and then at college we teach them that their life is meaningless, they're only evolved from dust. Spend all your life in pleasure and passion, and then we give them all the tools and the means to do that for 4 to 7 years. And almost universally, through that process, droves of students are led into deep depression and anxieties and suicidal thoughts. And it's not that they're suffering the pains of life, because they're at the best they're going to be physically. Again, not to put a downer on it. Things just go downhill from here. But you're not working. You have all the pleasures that you want of company, of free time. You're at a good point physically, usually. And you've pushed the pleasure button all that you want to and found that pleasure itself is not fulfilling. And so Solomon says that even in laughter there may be a heartache, and at the end of joy may be grief. That if you keep on seeking pleasure for pleasure's sake, you're going to find that it's not what you want. And so the problem of pain is not that there's nothing beneficial in pain. The problem in pleasure is that there's not really anything beneficial if you seek pleasure for pleasure's sake.
How many lottery winners have found nothing but misery and sorrow?
think it's 1 in 4 that are bankrupt within a year, and almost 70% within 10 years. Like it's a really high number.
But there's pleasure in their eyes if they achieve it.
Yeah. And and again, since this is Proverbs, you can view this from different aspects of wisdom. If you see someone laughing, does that always mean that they're free from anxiety or pains in their life? No. And if we're going to tie that back together with what we had read earlier in verse 10, that the heart knows its own bitterness and no stranger shares its joy, recognizing that just what someone portrays to you on the outward is not always truly a reflection of what's on the inward, and understanding that as well. Let's look at verse 14 and verse 15.
The backslider in heart will be filled with his own ways, but a good man will be satisfied from above. The simple believes every word, but the prudent considers his steps.
So he's going to compare in verse 14 these two people, the backslider and the good man. And if you get in the topic of once saved, always saved, you have to discount the backslider. You have to say that there never was a backslider because they've never achieved anything to backslide from. But that's another topic for another day. But he mentions that the backslider is going to get what?
The fruit of his ways.
Yeah. Not what was originally promised by the beginning of his course, but what is guaranteed by the end of his race, which is kind of Solomon's point. But the good man will be filled with the fruits of his ways. And someone who perseveres is considered good, I think, in Solomon's eyes. And then, kind of tying the idea we looked at earlier in verse 15, that the simple believes everything, but the prudent gives thought to his steps. Is there a common misbelief that Christians are naive or gullible to believe you believe that the earth was created in 6 days? We're gullible for believing. Do you really believe that God created from 8 people the entire earth and all of the races? Do you really believe? And then we find more and more evidence that yes, of course we believe. And we're often viewed as being gullible, and yet God always backs up what he tells us with a lot of evidence. That we aren't people who just simply believe everything, but we should be people who are prudent and give thought to the things that we believe and the things we do. Lee?
But the reason there's such a strong push that way is exactly because of the push, people then, you want to sound like you're smart too, so you want to jump on science, you want to jump on being one of those smart people, and that's why I think people twist the scriptures to try to satisfy that worldly understanding of where we came from, and somehow try to blend that with what God says, so that I can still sound smart around certain people, but somehow still believe in God as well. And trying to do that is not right. And this good man is not satisfied by that. This good man is satisfied from above. You can be satisfied and be called an idiot from a worldly viewpoint. You may look like a fool, but as long as we don't look like a fool to God, as long as we're faithful to God and we're wise in his word, that will definitely satisfy us. And I think that's what we all, as Christians, long for. Not to be accepted in some university or scholarly circles or something like that.
Yeah. And I think verse 16 ties in with that as well. We've been dealing with the same topic. So verse 16, the one who is wise is cautious and turns away from evil, but a fool is reckless and careless. How is it that we give thought to our steps? What does that practically mean? And you see that play out in people who are, you only have one life to live, so might as well just go ahead and do it anyways, or do whatever I want to. It doesn't make any sense. I don't get it. If you only have one life to live, which is true, then why not use it wisely to the best of our abilities? That seems to be the most sense. And part of that is going to be caution. The one who's wise is cautious and turns away from evil. The fool is reckless and careless, just doing whatever pleases, whatever suits, whatever comes to mind, whatever he wants to do now, without hardly any thought of consequences or end results. And that's what Solomon's implying here. That here in verse 17, the man of quick temper acts foolishly, and a man of evil devices is hated. Solomon has quite a bit to say about quick-temperedness, and so does James. Both of those places are important. And coming on the heels of someone who is reckless and careless, if you're tying in verse 16 to verse 17, they seem to kind of go together quite a bit, don't they? That the fool acts reckless and careless, and the quick-tempered person acts foolish as well, or foolish. Those two things seem to go hand in hand, of acting reckless and acting foolish out of quick-temperedness seems to be also tied together. How are we doing on time? I forgot to look. 7:50? Okay. Let's do just a couple more verses and then we'll wrap up for tonight. Let's read verses 18 through 21.
The simple inherit folly, the prudent are crowned with knowledge. The evil will bow before the good, and the wicked at the gates of the righteous. The poor man is hated, even by his own neighbor, but the rich has many friends. He who despises his neighbor sins, but he who has mercy on the poor happy.
All right, so a couple not directly connected ones, but he mentions that the simple inherit folly, and I think he's mentioned this in other ways earlier in the chapter, that kind of whatever you sow, you reap. However you live your life is what you're going to get in return, and if you're simple, you're going to inherit folly. But if you are prudent, you are crowned with knowledge. That those two things go together, and prudence goes along with caution. Caution goes along with the idea of also looking at one's steps. I think all of these ideas are tied together. What does he mean here in verse 19, that the evil bow down before the good and the wicked at the gates of the righteous? And again, remember that Solomon is presenting these as how things ought to be, how they should work out. And well, in Proverbs, he'll present it with sunshine. Ecclesiastes, he'll present it with a critical eye. But Joseph, for instance, you look at whenever Jacob took time to bow over his staff and bless his 12 sons. What happens the first few blessings that he gives out to the oldest? It doesn't go very well. After sleeping, in his father's bed, and after being a murderer for his second son, after then selling his other son into slavery, he kind of skips over the blessings for the first few. Consequently, what we have is Joseph, who inherits the vast majority of the blessings through two of his sons, and the dream is given to Joseph at a young age that all of his brothers will bow down before him. That's just kind of a quick, direct consequence. David, for instance, is somebody who is a man after God's own heart, who the whole nation bows down to. The same thing when it comes to Moses. Moses is chosen out of all the nation to lead the people, and he is humble, the most humble of all the people, and he found favor in God's eyes. So, for the most part, this comes true, that people who are righteous, do get to inherit the earth, as Jesus says.
I was going to say that's exactly right. When you're putting God first, and in all those cases, those men put God first, and then that's how the evil responded to them. Why? Because obviously God was blessing those godly men that were putting Him first, and so all those evil were not, rising up. When the evil rise up, it's because the good men are not being good anymore, or they're not putting God first.
The last two verses for tonight, verse 20 and 21, he deals with how people treat others who have physical possessions in abundance. So the poor person is disliked even by his neighbor, and the rich man has many friends. Solomon deals with this again over in chapter 19, verse 4 and verse 7, respectively. He says in verse 4 that wealth brings many new friends, but a poor man is deserted by his friends. And then verse 7, all a poor man's brothers hate him. How much more do his friends go far from him? He pursues them with words, but does not have them. What's Solomon's point here?
Well, it's saying that, at least to me, that people like you because you have stuff, but it's not like they're actually, really your friends. And then the poor people are disliked because it doesn't benefit the other people. But in reality, it's a sin for us not to be loving to our neighbor, even if he's poor, and that we are blessed if we are willing to be generous to those poor people.
Yeah, Solomon also says over in Ecclesiastes that when wealth increase, those who eat also increase. The more that you have, the more people who are going to be there to take it from you. And part of that, I think, comes, as John mentioned, about the lottery winners. You find some people who go to extreme lengths, to board up their house or to change their names and move out of the area so that family members and friends don't crawl out of the woodwork and keep on asking for all their lottery winnings. You find that with anybody who's wealthy. You have people who tend to kind of take that for granted and kind of tend to so-and-so will kind of pick up the tab, or so-and-so is going to pay for this, or I'll just ask them and they're going to be able to take care of this. And people who have a lot less tend to be overlooked in a lot of areas of life, and not just in providing for other people, just in general. They get disregarded sometimes, by means of, well, maybe they deserve where they're at, and different types of justifications that we have. So Solomon deals with that quite a bit here in the book of Proverbs. So verse 21, blessed is he who is generous to the poor. Over in chapter 11 and in verse 12, he who belittles his neighbor lacks sense, but a man of understanding remains silent. He also mentions later on, I forgot to write down this cross-reference, that whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord. I wish I had that one memorized where it is. But we have passages, James chapter 2, that if you show partiality between the rich brother and the poor brother, you become a transgressor of the law because you've shown partiality. Jesus tells us over in Luke that whenever you go to throw a feast, do not just invite your neighbors, but also to invite the poor and those who are hungry, so that they may not repay you in turn. How many times does Jesus go and spend time with the lepers and the blind beggars and those who are sleeping at the pool of Bethsaida, just waiting for the waters to be stirred? That's all they have in their life, is just waiting for the angel to come down and stir the waters in John chapter 5. And yet Jesus takes time with that person. And so what we see is, he who despises his neighbor is a sinner. And that is not a direct tie to whether he's poor or rich. But then he continues on at the end of verse 21, blessed is he who is generous to the poor. And the list kind of goes on and on, that if someone sues you for your second tunic, give them your cloak also. We're called to a lot when it comes to wealth. And being Americans, so we probably have to step up to the plate quite a bit for that. Any thoughts up to the end of the chapter?
Every time I read that verse 20, Lee may have experienced this too, being overseas for so many years. You show me someone overseas in the military with an American pickup truck, I'll show you a guy that has more friends than anyone. Everybody loves the guy with a pickup truck. I wanted to say, maybe I'm unique in this, and I've studied Proverbs 2 times over, or maybe more than that. And when I would study Proverbs, I would go through it. And a lot of it you can just read and you can understand, but sometimes there's a speed bump and you bump over that and you keep on going and you never stop and pick it up.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm seeing now is if as you're looking at it, think of when you explained verse 10 earlier, Chad, that makes perfect sense after you said that. even if I wasn't here and I stopped with Proverbs and I take these, like you said, and piece those two parts together and how they complement each other, I don't think it's as difficult to understand as maybe I might stop when I bump over some of these verses, like, okay, let me keep on going to something that makes sense, I got that part. And I think maybe Proverbs is not unique in that, but it is one of the books that you can go through one chapter and understand like 75%, and you skip the other part because you just don't want to slow down to try to stop and understand it. And maybe I should, or maybe we should all try to do better with that. I was wondering, maybe the problem with it is 10 years from now, when I'm reading these same verses again in another study, will I recall how they were explained, or should I not desire to have the ability to, and desire to stop and read it? Because I think that we can comprehend these better than maybe what we realize, and make application. And there's probably different scenarios you could apply these to, because they're fitting in other scenarios as well.
Yeah, I think that's exactly how Solomon wrote them, is to be not only fitting to one application, but multiple ones. And these are Eastern writings. You know, if you go to any Eastern culture, Proverbs are still huge to them, as well as symbolic stories. And this is, you know, a very, very Eastern setting of Scripture in that sense. And it works well. I mean, we do a really good job of remembering stories, sometimes a lot better than we do of just rote fact. And so I think what Solomon does is he gives us a lot of really good information here that I wish that we'd spent more time in Proverbs kind of with some of our young people before we send them out in the world than we do in maybe some other areas. There's so much practical knowledge here that is more necessary than other things before we send them out. Rather than, I think I've heard the complaint before of only dealing with drugs and drinking, dealing with that as well as overall problems. Obviously, as you get later on to Proverbs, Solomon gives probably probably the best examples of what it means to be drunk and the influences and the consequences of alcohol abuse here in Proverbs as well. So we're going to pick up there next week. I am super happy that I didn't have to do this in front of a camera. It is really good to see you guys. So we'll pick up there in verse 22 next week. And we may or may not get to the beginning of chapter 15. We're just going to take it as many verses as we can. Obviously, Solomon did not have chapter divisions. We're going to not pay attention to chapter divisions as we move forward either.